don't know. I sent him the link.
Um, so this is our 10th Zoom podcast. Chris Corpus will be here shortly. And we are with Dr. Micheál Cahill from Ireland, living in Dallas, PhD in Auckland, New Zealand, and recently visited Brazil. So Micheál, can you tell everybody a little bit more about you?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a mixed bag. And that's probably why a lot of my answers kind of will always begin with it depends, because I would like to think I've learned a few things just from different cultures across the world. So originally from Ireland, born and raised in Ireland, did my undergraduate and my bachelor's there, was a Gaelic football athlete, actually. Tony was my main sport. I played there as such. We're not renowned for our 100-meter middle distance, our sprinters. We tend to produce a little bit more of middle to long distance. But after that, then I have been, I suppose, over and back from Texas, really, for the last decade now. Yeah, my first stint there was at Waco, Texas in 2010. Was there for the year, went back to Ireland, did my master's in sports performance, and then moved over here full-time in 2013. So 2013, I took a role at a place you've been, Tony, I know multiple times, through a good mutual friend of ours, Doug Robinson, as Director of Sports Science at Jesuit College Prep. So again, I was very, very lucky to be exposed to 750 athletes across 21 different sports, dealing with multiple, not only athlete personalities, but also coach personalities, working with sport coaches as well. Was there for 5 years. In that period of time, I did my PhD at Auckland University of Technology. I was a full-time student, so I would like to think I definitely was the longest commuting student in the world. I used to have my meetings at the halfway point in Cardiff in Wales, where I would meet my primary and secondary supervisor, John Oliver and John Cronin, who published a lot in the area. So very lucky. And then I had in-country supervisor, a very close friend of mine, and also a mutual friend of ours, Ken Clark, was my guy in Philadelphia then as well. But he was obviously met him at SMU, and he was at Dr. Peter Wayan's lab. And then the last 2 years, I took a role with athlete training and health. So as a vice president of performance and sports science, where I oversee all the training across all our 5 training programs, right from as young as 8 years of age to 88, to as low as someone coming back from rehabilitation to preparing for the NFL Combine, and work a lot with the coaches in that. So I've been in that role now for the last 2 years.
Is that private?
Yes, yeah, we're private, but what we do, Tony, we actually we merge with a hospital campus. So we're actually merged with Memorial Hermann in Houston and Texas Health in Dallas, which are arguably two of the biggest if they're the biggest in Texas, they're the biggest in the US healthcare providers. And we build on their campus. So the building, and we take in the cardiologists, the physical therapists. We put a fully floodlit soccer field on there as well. We have merged with FC Dallas's youth athletes, in addition to Dynamo Dash in Houston's youth academies too. And yeah, we kind of try, and the way I describe it is, a hospital is a pillar of a community and caters for everyone in the community. What we try and do is mirror that pillar of preventative health and just provide health, fitness, and performance for all.
Nice. 2 questions about your background story. How would you explain Gaelic football to an American?
YouTube.
It's because I really can't explain it.
Yeah, no, honestly, it's obviously a really good sport. It's a hybrid of, usually I just tell people it's like a hybrid of basketball, volleyball, soccer, and rugby, but it's played on a field 170 yards long and 90 yards wide, and it usually intrigues people enough to type the 2 words Gaelic football into YouTube.
I have a friend named Russ Bradford who has written 4 wonderful books, and one of the books he wrote was Paddy on the Hardwood. This guy was an American basketball coach that was great, and he went to Ireland to learn how to play the Irish fiddle. Okay. And he took over a professional basketball team in Ireland, and his best player was also a Gaelic football star. Matter of fact, I can't remember his name now, but supposedly he was terrific and everything. So they are very basketball-like people, right?
Yeah, it's probably Kieran Donaghy. Is that his name?
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's who he was.
Yeah.
It's a terrific book. That's because he was like 6'3", 6'4", was a good basketball player. And
yeah. No, and it's one of the other areas, I suppose, and we'll get into the resisted sled training, but one of the big areas for me is long-term athlete development and pediatric exercise physiology and how youth athletes adapt. And like Gaelic football is phenomenal from that standpoint of its hand-eye, its foot-eye, its sprint, it's got an aerobic backdrop, so it actually provides a good stimulus for well-rounded long-term athlete development as well.
And one last background question. Why did you pick Auckland?
Because they're ranked fourth in the world for sports performance. So if I was going to do a PhD and spend X amount of money, I wanted to make sure that I went to one of the most reputable or best in the world. So, I mean, John Cronin had, I think 300 and, about 350, probably 400 publications at the time. John Oliver is a worldwide expert in pediatric exercise physiology. And I would like to think I got to Ken before he was as big a name he is now. 5 years ago, he is at a meteoric rise in the area. So I'm now a research associate with them as well and supervising research in the area for those students domiciled in the US. So,
Chris, you made it.
Made it.
Hey, Chris.
Good group tonight. We're still training. We haven't stopped. Michal, how are you?
I'm good. How have you been?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
When he did his dissertation in New Zealand, I was there too. And for some reason, they let us all out together. So it'd be like a bad joke. There's an Irishman, an Englishman, and a New Zealander, and an American driving around. And that was basically our trip.
Walked in a bar.
Yeah.
No, it definitely was. It was a good trip. It was a good time in New Zealand.
It was a good time. We had a lot of fun. A real good time. But sorry I'm late. I thought we were starting at 7:15. I thought that's what I scheduled, but I guess it wasn't. But we're okay now.
We're okay. Now. We're all here.
I'll call you by your proper name because nobody knows that I have a nickname for you, and so I won't call you the nickname. We'll keep that personal.
You can call me by the nickname if you want. I prefer I'm top marks to Tony for his pronunciation on it.
Top marks.
So when Michal came for the first time and we did our overspeed research, Ken called him Irish Mike. So I called him Irish Mike. So when we went to New Zealand, he's doing his, he's defending his paper and all that stuff. And I was calling him Irish Mike there. Nobody knew who I was talking about. And so everyone goes, well, if Corfus is calling him Irish Mike, we're all going to call him Irish Mike. And so then he got pissed. He says, no, it's Michal. So I said, all right, I'm just going with Dr. Irish Mike then.
It took me a few years to shake it. I finally shaked it. And then Chris bloody dug it up the other side of the world.
So I'm going to start with some questions here. The first one is, who else uses the word domiciled?
You know what? I've got stick for that back in Ireland as well. I got to get rid of that. That must be, maybe that's because of all the immigration bloody loopholes I have to go through. Maybe it's just me and custom officers that use that for my green card application.
What does domicile mean? I'm sorry.
Reside in. Where do you
reside? Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
I get asked that every time I enter the US. Where are you domiciled? I have to go through but you're US citizens. You don't need to go through that rigmarole.
No.
But that's a question so I got to get rid of that one because I'm getting that from all angles now.
So Michal and I talked earlier as well. So I gave him some questions so he could be prepared. Sorry for not setting any traps for you. I wouldn't do that to you, except for the domiciled question. So we'll start with this. So I was out there when he defended his dissertation. And it was kind of a cool situation because John Cronin, again, probably one of by far the most prodigious researcher in speed and stuff, was his main, what would you call him, your main supervisor?
Yeah, he was my main supervisor, my primary, yeah.
And so then John Oliver, who's at Cardiff University in England.
Yeah, him and Rodri were on it as well, and they're pioneering really youth all over the world.
you know, the couple of days before his dissertation, we were all kind of talking sled training and things like that, which was a great conversation. And if you haven't had a chance to read his paper, it's a phenomenal paper. And I know some idiot on social media knocked him for it. And it's like, you didn't even read the paper, dude. In fact, when he defended his paper, there were no changes to it. And when John Cronin, came out and said it was so well done that normally there's a process where you have to change things and they question you on stuff. And it's like, no, it's a perfect paper. It was brilliant. So for the people that are here, and if you're listening tomorrow, because I'm finding out that everyone's listening the day after, because I'm getting all kinds of stuff that I'm listening to it in class right now. So if you get a chance, read the paper. It's worth the time. And there's a layer of research that goes through. So I'm going to say
the one I got 6 publications out of it. So the last one is very much so written for the coach as a concluding. The one, it just came out in December, as it's a concluding one. So it's on my research gate. It's called When to Push and When to Pull. So,
yeah, good stuff. So I'm going to say, Michal won't like me saying this, but I've read JB Morin's papers, and they're great papers, and that research stuff is good. But I think for an everyday coach, I think Michal's papers are much more appropriate for the group that we have here. It's easy to apply for everyday athletes, you know, our high school athletes, our middle school athletes. And it's easy to follow as far as the application, which is why I think the app, I haven't seen the app. I just saw the app when I saw your presentation. Thanks for giving me a heads up on that. I thought we were friends. I guess not.
I thought I sent you that.
Yeah, thanks. So
it's no holds barred tonight. Okay, I have my list here. I better turn the page.
So when we're doing, and I have a 1080, and I've been pulling people for years, and we've had conversations about that.
Just that one, Chris. It's literally out there. Just arrived, 1080.
Now I got a better question before we get to that. How come you're not in your garage with all the posters in the theater?
I am.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, of course I'm here.
We stayed up till 2 o'clock one night, discussing what posters to put in his garage. That's actually his garage.
It's a media room or home theater now, though, Chris.
So when you have people towing, I don't like the term KPIs. I really don't know what it means, but I know everyone else knows what it means. What are you looking for at different loads and at different velocities? And I think you touched on that a little bit in your thing with speed, strength, speed, and all that. But what are some angles that you look for at different velocities at those different levels that you had in your presentation?
Yeah. There's definitely some key areas. I think I always loved Ralph Mann's, PALS system. And, so from a posture standpoint, the main thing from just across the board looking for in the sled is the increase in the forward lean. And obviously the heavier you go, you can get more of a forward lean to where hopefully you can improve the foot strike or the orientation of the foot strike. And therefore you mightn't increase the amount of net force, but what you may do is increase the horizontal force, or you may be able to optimize the direction of force, which we know is key for acceleration. So really from a posture standpoint, looking from a forward lean, the key for me is straight line from ear to heel. So I always say when you're looking at resisted sprinting, because what's simple sometimes with it is just think of it, how would you do it in a back squat? That's how I always compare it. You're not going to prescribe load in a back squat and walk away. You're going to watch and see does the background, and you're going to watch are the angles the same. So for me in resisted sled training, it's the same as well, because if you get a break in from ear to heel, an excessive break in the hips, which, that can happen. And ironically, I see it happen more with with too heavy a pull. You'll see the posterior load will break the hips, and then you'll have a rounding. What happens is then you're just directing force down, which is not really what we're trying to optimize in that short distance or only the acceleration. Me and Ken have these hilarious conversations. Because we're in the same wavelength, me and Ken, on everything. And we, this argument of what's better, horizontal or vertical, is just a hilarious argument, because you can't have one without the other. And if you didn't have vertical force, even acceleration, all you do is break your nose every time you try and sprint, because you need enough to keep you vertical. So, but what we want to do, obviously, with the resisted sled really is, to me, is confined to that earlier initial acceleration phase. And we need to, so that's what we're getting from the forward lean. That's the big thing across the board. One thing to watch out for is heavy pull will break the hips, because it may be from behind. But then what's interesting is from a push, I've actually only really moved, if I'm looking from a speed development and not like a holistic long-term athlete development standpoint, which I can get into later. But on the pushing is, unless it's heavy, I don't use it on a push, because what I've seen with athletes is the skis will fly out in front. And then you get from the front, you get the back cocked up and you have a flat back. And I think I showed a picture of that in my presentation as well. So, and then when you pick up higher velocities, that tends to happen. And really that defeats the whole purpose of what I see resisted sled training as, is a complementary strength, or kind of sprint specific strength that can complement it. So I always say it doesn't substitute for anything. It supplements and it complements. And if it's going to substitute for anything, and I think it's important, just before I go into the KPIs, give a little background of where it came, is it substitutes for like a strength, vertical plane strength exercise, like a squat. So where this originally came from with me with resisted sled training was, my background is in strength conditioning and sports science. My real kind of passion for track and field and sprinting only came when I got to the US, really, because I was just telling Tony before he got on, in Ireland, we don't produce too many 100-meter champions, right? We're kind of middle distance, long distance. We don't have the gene pool you guys have, right? So I'm actually a big guy in Ireland, believe it or not. I'm not a big guy here at all. So I come from that area. So when I first looked at this, my reason for getting into resisted sled training was in no way to do with sprinting. It was actually that culturally, I had seen the US spend, back in 2010 anyway, in the collegiate, we worked at a few different universities as well, spend way too much time in the weight room, but valued the 40, but 90% of the time spent in the weight room, getting to this exact percentage of 87.5% on back squat, you know, and then the amount of time planning these in the hope it would transfer to speed. And then, unfortunately, 10 years ago, we got this whole thing to where it was, well, back squat will help your 5-meter sprint time. And there's no research to show that at all. So I started to look at it from, well, surely there's a way of adding supplementary strength in a horizontal plane of motion, which will actually aid a holistic sprint training program better than vertical plane squatting. So me and Doug Robinson had a conversation 5 years ago. And Doug is very much so on the sprint side. And I just said, well, hey, Doug, how about in the weight room, I start working on some resisted sled training to replace some of the deadlift or some of the squat with our post-peak height velocity athletes, because I believe they need a different stimulus in the weight room in a more horizontal plane of motion to where he still did all his sprint training. And we were trying to figure out the training compatibility of this. So that's just a little background, which I think important when I talk about the KPIs, because I was looking at it from a strength conditioning or sports science standpoint. But the big one I look for from a posture is the straight line from ear to heel. With moderate, I like the belt, and with some moderate loading is that they use the belt at the waist to push their hips in extension, so that I'm emphasizing good mechanics, but not doing, let's say, Doug's job as such, you know. But if I can help in the weight room to re-emphasize some key points for Doug, that helped as well during some horizontal strength training. But the main thing in the posture is don't let the back round. And what I put is, you know, if you prescribe the load and squat, would you just walk away and not look and see if the back's rounding? No, if the back's rounding, you adjust the load to optimize the angle. So that's the big thing. It's not just, there's no magic number. And then with the legs, I actually found it anecdotally really good for the athletes, especially young athletes, you know, middle school and high school, to really emphasize the large and aggressive punch push action. And even, you know, me and Ken did some work at Jesuit with athletes, just with those coaching cues and push, punch, and getting that cyclical action with the legs and to push the ground away. So really from the ground aspect, the last point of contact, push the ground away. Then when we get to more so the legs, it was the push punch. And then from a posture standpoint, we were looking with a straight line from ear to heel. I went on a little bit there, but us Irish have the gift of the gab, I suppose.
You know, my favorite slide in your presentation was the picture of the sprinter coming out of the blocks and with 2 arrows saying the squat does this and the deadlift does that.
Yeah, the hips
or was it the clean?
The clean,
the squat.
Yeah, and I'll never forget it, Tony. I should have said it. That's exactly the moment I started going,
yes,
this is mad.
And it's I can understand, but I can understand why people who are weight room centric want to believe that so bad that they will. But the way you explained it, both of those things are vertical.
Yeah,
totally. And the guy coming out is not vertical.
Yeah, no, he's not. You know, and that's my real, and you've seen that in the rest of the presentation, was to really hone in on the early to initial acceleration phase and optimize it. And I just figured, right, if I'm going to complement, you know, this was right back when it started, how can I best complement my track and field coach? You know, and, you know, at some points, you know, like Tony, which I'm sure you use an iteration of, because now I love working with sprinters, and, you know, I'll use a compete, teach, compete, or max effort, teach, compete. So where we'll get them to go max effort, and then we'll slow them down in order to emphasize some area with a drill or with some aspect of it. And then we'll get them to go max effort again. And I was just taking that approach in the weight room. Well, here's a chance for me to re-emphasize some good postural cues to a certain extent as well in the weight room. That'll hopefully transfer. So look, because the last thing I want to do is feed into the kind of bigger, faster, stronger mentality, which in my opinion was what I wanted to get away from when I first got here. Was, God, there's so much about just putting weight on the bar, moving it slowly. I'm like, surely there's a more efficient way for sprint specific strength to, if we can I pick out a way that's unilateral, that's cyclical, that increases a forward lean, and that can hopefully direct or optimize force in the direction we want for that phase of the sprinting. So yeah, and that picture, like pointing to someone, I'll never forget it. It was said to me 10 years ago and early to the day, is pointed to it was a person coming out of blocks, pointed to his knee and said, squat is knee dominant. That's why we squat. And then pointed to its hips and went, clean is hip dominant. That's why we clean. And I'm going, it just made me more puzzled.
So while we're on the topic of Olympic lifts, have you seen any correlation? I know there's the old famous paper that no one ever found, that the Olympic lifters are beating the sprinters in the 10 meter run and things like that. You've logged a lot of data on people pulling, and you've seen people clean, because I'm sure there's places that you've been where people clean. Have you seen any correlation between the two?
No, that's where, like, no, I'm still looking for that paper as well. I somehow I can't find it either, and I'm pretty good at looking through research libraries. But yeah,
once we got our AUT, our OT special password, it opened up a lot of doors to what we can get, and I couldn't find it either.
Yeah. What I will tell you is, because you said correlation, is yes, it's correlated, and I'll kind of tell you why, but it doesn't mean there's correlation versus causation. And usually where you will see it is you'll see it in youth athletes. Well, and you know, that's my other big area, is we got to be very careful before we pat ourselves on the backs as coaches when dealing with youth athletes, because youth athletes get faster and stronger each year. You know, on average, we see natural gains in pre to mid peak height velocity or growth spurt up until around that 14 age. We'll see them get 3% faster each year just by growing. But then what happens is we see that severed to about 1.5 to 0.8% as soon as they get past their growth spurt. So it's severed in half. So that's really where you can assess whether your training is working, is only when you're assessing for maturation. So if your program consists of Olympic lifts and squats, you know, for the younger athletes, you know, you really want to see, the real test is, well, what happens when they're not just naturally maturing and getting faster and stronger? you know, and again, it's not to say I don't do them. That's why for me, every answer begins with, it depends. Like, I think youth athletes need primarily, you know, they need a lot. They need a holistic program first off. That's why, to me, social media is very dangerous, right? They need a holistic program first off, not just a piece of the pie. They need to be exposed to high force movements, because we know that strength or force underpins biomotor control. But they also need to be exposed to drastic high velocity movements, such as unresisted sprinting, because that produces the most amount of force, you know, as well. So we need high velocity movements, but then they also need to be put with some foundational strength exercises just for the overall development of the athlete. And there's tons of research to suggest that. You know, Beringer has suggested a higher than 80% 1RM, but it doesn't mean we go to failure on it the whole time either. So, but I haven't found that, no.
All right, I'm going to throw some questions at you from the Q&A. If you're programming sleds, would you 75% velocity decrement push sleds, 50% velocity decrement pull sled, 25% velocity decrement pull sled?
To me, again, it depends, and I don't want to give roundabout answers, but for the pushing, this is what I use the pushing for. I usually go on a high V deck for the pushing. One of the areas that I like it for is I only use it as an early preparatory phase of horizontal strength training. You know, so dependent on the window of time. If I have a longer window of time, I'll include the heavy horizontal push sled. I actually like, another reason I like the heavy horizontal push sled from a track and field standpoint is we do wall drills. Well, from what I've seen is I actually think athletes get a little bit more out of doing a really heavy prowler. So they're just have their hands on the prowler, and I found they get a bit more of a feel for the push punch aspect of striking the ground rather than just doing it against a wall because they're kind of moving somewhere. That's an area that I found from a technical standpoint, because it's a little bit of a progression that, okay, you can maintain it. If we think simple, static to dynamic, you know, you can maintain your wall drill in a static position. Let's put you at a low velocity dynamic position, you know, and that's solely from a track standpoint. Then if I'm dealing with position specific, like football, I think it's very good. The pushing is important at heavy. I don't really use pushing at anymore. And that's why that's the good thing. I studied it. I was one of the first really on sled pushing. I don't think there's been much done on it to do. And I really wouldn't use sled pushing at 50% or 25% because I find the skis get too far and it affects your mechanics. And all of a sudden, if that line breaks excessively in the hips, it's not a sprint specific complementary strength exercise anymore, because you're not optimizing the direction of the force for early acceleration, where that's my opinion. Sleds are only good for early acceleration, really. And then with the sled pulls, I think you can periodize. My recent paper has kind of examples of how to periodize that. For example, with some combine athletes or football athletes we've worked with, you know, for 8 weeks, I might do 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a 75% VDEC, 2 weeks at 50, and then the last few weeks, 2 weeks will get into 25%. My thing is, can you rationalize it? So am I doing it to just reduce the load and increase the intensity of the high velocity and sprinting so that everything is moving towards that? And then one thing with the 75% VDEC, which is obviously I saw greatest gains with some of my studies in short distance acceleration, is I find it good for team sport athletes. So if you're working with team sport athletes, that is not solely track and field. If we're talking about team sport athletes, I find it really good because I think that their training load can be so high and they do so many 20-yard sprints that what I think is we're adding a level of resistance that adds a new stimulus to the team sport athlete. Team sport athlete does an outrageous amounts of just short distance acceleration. And sometimes their fatigue level, we have to be careful when we expose them to max velocity. And I love exposing them to max velocity later in the week as they freshen, so the body is prepared for when they achieve that on Saturday, and we're less likely to get a hamstring tear because we've exposed them to that high velocity. But earlier in the week, you know, we might want to be a little bit cautious with our team sport athletes. So this can be a good tool to use, resisted sprinting, because it allows them to go max effort at a slightly lower velocity. And hopefully the angle we put them in optimizes the direction of force.
One of my favorite things I loved a lot of things in your presentation, but I've always complained that there are so many speed coaches out there who I say they want to plant beans and grow corn. They want to do everything. You know, they want to lift, stretch, push sleds, pull sleds. I mean, they want to do planks. They want to do all these things, but they don't want a max speed sprint, and which blows my mind. And so my entire program has been kind of like in response to those people, you know, like, no, we max speed sprint. But I love the way you say it's meant to supplement training. It's not a substitute for training.
Yeah. And I'll give you a prime example with that one, Tony. And by the way, Tony, if I can even get you to wear a waist belt, my year is made.
Well, I'm actually considering it as just a fashion statement after spending all day with you.
No, that's good. But a prime example is, you know, I did a little bit of work for Major League in baseball, just presentation. And, you know, the games are so long. There's so much time on feet, you know, with the travel, and they come back. And then, you know, for them, I can understand. Now, I don't agree with not achieving max velocity, but there's some days in the week to where they can't. And if you look at base running for those athletes as well, that's not to say they shouldn't get that stimulus. But again, I agree with what you said. And what I'll say, and one of the best things that was said to me is, just because you take a load of ingredients and throw it in a bowl doesn't mean you get a nice bowl of soup. So for me, it's, can you rationalize when and how you use it, at what time of the season, what time in the week you use it as well? And does it work? Because one of the other things, Tony, like you talked about, like with coaches, for me, the biggest thing I learned was with coaches. Like, I've used sleds as a smoke and mirror thing, you know, sometimes with, from a football standpoint, dealing with football coaches at times who want to get load in them. But what I want to get is I want to get them faster. I want something that transfers onto the field. So I'll, you know, say, well, we're going to do a heavy resisted sled training, you know, and love it because there's that good intent, you know, and sometimes there's that area. One thing I noticed from a research study is, you know, I don't think that a stimulus, because, you know, one of the biggest misinterpretations of my research, and this is one of the downfalls with research as well, is that when you do research, it needs three things. You know, it needs to be impactful, it needs to be robust, and it's got to have a level of rigor to it as well. So, you know, I would have done a 0 to 30 meter sprint, you know, and then I would have done my different resisted loads that corresponded to that. If I really wanted to test kind of unresisted, what I would do is have them do flying 10s, flying 20s. I think that's what team sport athletes need exposure to, because I think they do so much of 0 from a start. So I think the start, I think that's where it can be really impactful for at that higher loads to improve initial acceleration. And how I use this is warm up, finish the warm up with potentiation, move into our plyometrics, get them primed. I get my max velocity, or I get our highest velocity movements done. And it's not to say I do it every day, but when I do it, and then once that's achieved, I use resisted sled training as a transition activity from the turf or my sprint and jump work before we go into the weight room. And then before we get into the weight room, dependent on the athlete, for example, when I go heavy on a resisted sled pull, I actually pull back on my bilateral squatting because I've seen an adductor strain. And if we think of, like, you know, I've used these to prep a marathon runner. I train a Nike athlete, and we were prepping for the Olympic trials, and it was a hilly course. And, you know, to prep a marathon runner for a hilly course, you need to strengthen their adductors, you know, so uphill running and everything. So I think that the resisted sprinting could place. So what I saw with some of my team sport athletes, Some asymmetries, especially in soccer, are more common because of kicking dominancy. Lacrosse as well tends to have it, that I would pull back on bilateral squatting because I think I got enough of a stimulus in my heavy resisted sled pulling. Then in season, I could use that in season. You know, in the preseason, I could do the opposite. I could go lighter and on my sled pulling, try achieve a bit more of a higher velocity. And we'll go back to hitting some heavier bilateral stuff. So I hate to keep giving the "it depends" answer, but it really does depend on the athlete, the coach, the season, the sport, and the demands and the context.
Another question. So do you think the old style hip sled where you stand up is more beneficial for sprinting?
The hip sled?
Yeah, I'm not. Jeff, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Tony, can you let him in so he can talk? Do we have that power?
I don't know how. I don't know anything about Zoom.
The hip sled, I wonder, is that the waist belt that he's referring to over the shoulder harness? Because if that is it, I much prefer the waist belt.
Let's see if he's on the chat here.
I much prefer the waist belt over the shoulder harness, and that's for sure.
All right, when Jeff gets back to us on that one, due to limited resources, you may need to split half, 1-2 group on sleds and half in the weight room. What would you recommend to pair in the weight room? Complementary horizontal force or vertical force?
Oh, maybe he's going hip thrust. Hip thrust would be, okay.
This is a different question from a different person I just asked.
Okay, yeah, I would, if you're going heavy on it, I would just try and pair it with a hip dominant exercise rather than going with another knee dominant one. I think it can be a little bit too much on the knee dominant and the adductor. So what I paired it with was a hip thrust exercise. I paired sled with some hip thrust exercise. And I did some single leg rear foot elevated split squat as well, because you can't get the load as high. So, but look, that's a really good question. And I'm just hopeful if my research, the next chapter of it is to open up the training compatibility questions. So I would be even interested to hear.
One of my questions, how does your work, and I kind of know the answer to this, but I just want to hear you say it. How does your work compare to JB Morin's work in his group? Because we all know, we all talk. Johan's been much, very friendly and forthcoming with stuff. So how did this advance what JB has done, or complement or developed or pushed it forward?
Yeah, I think, look, JB, Pierre Samazino, Matt Cross, they did a lot of the pioneering work from a physics standpoint. Like, I'm a coach first and foremost. I joke, like Ken Clark's on every single one of my papers to ensure that I'm a little bit like you, Chris, that my ideas don't defy the laws of physics. So I make sure Ken makes sure as I'm not defying laws of physics with my ideas. So I think that, JB, Pierre Samazino, Matt Cross, they really pioneered the way. But where I'm grateful is I think they created an area and paved the path for me to be very, very practical in what coaches need and hopefully how they can use that. So my answer to that is in the title of the presentation. First one is assess. I saw a gap to where I believed that coaches needed a tool to just assess more qualitatively. So, which has kind of come up with a 1RM, and it's not and that they can set it off a velocity decrement. So the app at the website mcahillphd.com/resisted sled training will allow people to just plug in the highest velocity that they achieve, whether it's, meters squared or whether it's or meters per second or miles per hour or even kilometers per hour, to be able to assess more qualitatively. Where that came from was when I started, I would call up professional clubs and say, well, what load do you use? I called one up in Ireland and they would say, oh, we put 60 kg on it, let's say 100 pounds. But if it's wet, we put 130 pounds on it. Now, again, let's just go straight back to the squat. The squat does not have as much transference as a sprint specific exercise. but we will spend X amount of time programming in back squats, performing 1RM back squat tests, have linear positions transducers to be able to assess 1RM for squat. And we're all trying to get a faster 40. Just didn't make sense for me. So I wanted a more qualitative way to it. If you are going to use resisted sled training, to qualitatively prescribe it based off that athlete's speed. The next one is to prescribe. I wanted it to be able to prescribe over multiple loads. So I was lucky enough to be able to do that and see the effect of it across multiple loads, to where, we saw that it's primarily the early to initial acceleration. And also, we got to be careful of, we can't forget, which is the maladaptation. But again, logic is the beginning of wisdom. It's not the end. And I said that in my presentation as well. If you have a group of athletes sprint, I had them 8 yards at a 75% VDEC, velocity decrement, really heavy. We're only hitting 2 meters per second. Yeah, it improved their ability to apply force in a more horizontal direction, improve the initial acceleration, but it killed their Vmax. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. They didn't achieve max velocity, So I learned that the hard way with one of my sprinters who was actually force dominant already. And then I had her doing some sled work. And as a 100-meter sprinter, I did not help her, but did I help team sport athletes get from A to B in a shorter space of time? 100% I did. They mightn't achieve max velocity a whole pile in the game. Doesn't mean doesn't mean that we don't give them the stimulus for other reasons, such as injury prevention, such as just if you're doing plyometrics to try and get a plyometric response on and off the ground as quick as you can, but you won't do max velocity sprinting, that's pretty hypocritical, right? Max velocity sprinting is the best plyometric you can do. So that would be to prescribe. And then for me, the last thing with JB's group, I met JB multiple times, lovely fella. I really wanted to, and that's my latest article, is provide practical coaching guidelines for coaches. And my rule was every paper I wrote that I wanted a coach, as soon as they read it, to be able to do one of three things, be able to go, okay, I'm going to employ this because I work with one-to-one. I'm going to apply this to the letter of the word really qualitatively. They could look at it as a second tier and go, I work with a group of 10 to 12 athletes. I'm going to be able to take this at a mid-tier, be able to generate some norms, and I'll be able to train in different zones or roughly in these zones. Or someone who works with a massive group of athletes and at the bottom tier, all they take from it was, I didn't know we can go a bit heavier to improve the initial acceleration aspect, so they're my three areas really. Is that what you were thinking I was going to say or no?
Yeah. Jeff came back and said it's a weight machine that is angled approximately 45 to 60 degrees. You can either lay down and lift the weight you put up on with like a leg press, or stand up, and it's kind of like a reverse hack squat. So you drive up at that 45-degree angle. Yeah,
I only came across them recently. I think they could be good. I think the question to it, just remind me, was would I use one or the other, or just what's my opinion on them?
I think it was, is that more beneficial to sprinting?
I only came across them recently. First off, with those, it's logistics. You can have one athlete on them at a time. You can't bring them out onto the turf as well. So the utility wouldn't be as high. I don't know to say they're not good, but if I was a betting man, I would be betting that I can put someone and I can watch their angles, help the track coach and ensure, hey, I got you covered on forward lean here, or at least I'm going to ensure proper mechanics. And then also that it's, cyclical in nature. We're going from right to left leg and we're going at max effort. I would choose the sled over it, but not to say that it can't be your other area you would use to emphasize horizontal strength training or horizontal force vector emphasis. But I think there's a difference between that horizontal force vector emphasis and what I categorize as horizontal strength training. actually pushing in because most simply how I got it was when me and Tony were mentioning the knee dominancy and hip dominancy and everything being vertical plane was like, all right, A to B. Well, when we make people sprint, we want them to go from A to C. So I believe you need to be moving in that plane of direction if it is a sprint specific complementary exercise. I don't know enough about that piece of equipment. I hope that's answered it.
Then he tried to get me, probably designed by Boyd Epley after my Boyd Epley rant last night. I have to give Boyd Epley credit, though, because without Boyd Epley, there would be no strength coaches and we wouldn't be having this forum, because he was the one who professionalized strength coaches. And he was very smart on how he did it. Everything led back to him, whether it was your registration, because he started the NSCA.
Yeah.
That was his.
He's
a brilliant businessman and a good strength coach. The guy that I learned under when I GA'd at Northern Illinois was a coach at Nebraska. So I learned all that stuff in my early years.
I think on that, that's one of the big cultural things I noticed is, and I think it's changing for the better. And I think people are moving to more of a transference and, taking a sprint or speed training approach to things as well. And it's not all just about load and weight on a barbell in a vertical plane of motion. But it's one of the things I really noticed when I first got here 10 years ago was the way I described it was it can be a little bit like it's not an open floor plan of a house to where the strength conditioning coach lives in one room, the sport coach lives in the other room, or track and field coach lives in another room, and they live within their four walls and they got what they do. And then, okay, you do your strength thing. Whereas what I want to do is knock those walls down and be like, well, how can I assist in a more sprint specific strength way to assist and complement your sprint training program?
And in defense of Boyd Epley as well, I really think that he was a pioneer outside of the weight room, where he really, really believed in speed and power drills with enough recovery to repeat it. He, back in the 80s, believed kind of like what I say, that tired is the enemy, not the goal in speed and power training. Whereas there's coaches in 2020, they're still trying to get kids tired above all else. And if you're doing that, that is not the bouncy, explosive, fast type of play that you want with a football team.
Yeah. And that's a key thing for people taking this who don't have the resources. And I think I had a slide in there is that, just use time, because the last thing you want to do is prescribe a load and then your rep lasts 10 seconds. I mean, then you start moving in, ATP to ATP CP, and that'll spike, when we start looking at those aspects at about 5 seconds. So I cut it at 5 seconds because I don't want residual fatigue. And then I make sure in this that they get 3 minutes rest in between sled work. And I do some, we'll do some corrective exercises. Usually what I'll focus on is what I learned a lot from you, Chris, is we'll focus on the foot and we'll just get them, to just really focusing on some of those intrinsic muscles in and around the ankle. We'll even do some core work in between. And it's kind of that active recovery before we go again. So
I would say that would be a KPI for me when doing heavy sleds, is if you can see that Achilles tendon bend, you're too heavy. And regardless of the foot position, once that Achilles bends, it's got to the energy's got to travel too far, and you're creating a bad pattern.
What do you mean by bending? You talking about lengthening?
You'll see if their foot isn't strong enough, they'll squish the heel, and you'll see a bulge coming out of the back of their ankle. That's their Achilles bending against the musculature, trying to force everything forward. For your presentation, Tony, I have a picture of it.
Good.
I've been working on it all day.
Can't wait.
Another question. I'm not going to get through all my questions. I have a bunch for you. Some good ones too. What are your thoughts on sprint speed treadmills, curved woodways, shred mills, overspeed treadmills? I won't get started on this topic. I'll leave it to you.
Well, look, you know me, we did the overspeed study with you. I believe you got to expose people to a high velocity. I think there's a potentiation effect to it as well. But I do think you need a solid foundation of technical competence in sprint mechanics before you really go near exposing someone to too much of an overspeed, because I don't think they'll be able to maintain those mechanics. And just like resisted sled training, like you're talking about, and it's like the likes of you, Chris, and we need looking at these areas of how to coach these things. That's what will move it forward. I'm hesitant with younger athletes on overspeed. The woodway curves, again, just even on them, you got to be pretty technically competent sprinter if it's a full curve. If it's a half curve, it's more forgiving. Full curve is not as forgiving. And, you know, if you don't have technical competence, you could go flying off that. So the overspeed work, you know, we did a study on the 1080. Chris, you literally nearly gave me a heart attack because you said, yeah, we'll pull them 10% faster. I think me and Ken had planned doing 5 to 3%, and then you just decided to go 10, but it's a good thing you did it.
Remember when the belt fell off of Ken and it knocked down my timers?
Yeah.
That's
So
scary.
overspeed is an area I want to get into.
Now that you have a 1080.
Now I have 1080 as well. You know, I'm not like, you know, I joke about resisted sled training. Like I really think it's a really valuable, really important tool. But I joke, I was texting someone recently. I said like, yeah, I use a stroller to take my kids for a walk. I don't take my kids for a walk in a prowler. Like I don't just use sleds. You know, I don't take my kids for a walk in a push sled. So I'm looking at really getting into some of that overspeed, but also some of the transitional work as well, where different resistance can kick in at a different point, or can actually decrease as you go through your sprint. So you can start at a heavy resistance for that initial acceleration, and then it can just diminish once you get through a certain phase.
Here's a question for both of you. If a coach does not have $20,000 to buy the 1080, I mean, I think we'd all agree that bungee cords, you know, probably shouldn't be used. Agreed?
I think I've seen people use them pretty well.
Really?
I've even tried them here and compared them to the 1080. I can get 4 good strides out of someone.
Yeah.
With the daisy chain, and sometimes that's all you need. And sometimes on the 1080, you're not going to get much more than that. You may get 6 or 8 really good strides because you have to get through the acceleration phase and get up to speed. And then depending on how long you have to run, and then people get nervous and they slow down when you get close to the machine and all that stuff. But I've gotten some good results using a daisy chaining a bunch of thin rubber bands together and give them a good pull over mini hurdles or a good pull on a sprint.
How about the Chris Mang talked about training Jordan last night with the Pulley System?
Yeah, that works. It's just after you have a 1080 and you can quantify things.
Yeah,
that's the big.
You know exactly how fast you're pulling people. And now Michal, did you get the garage door opener with it too? The ejecta button?
It's literally still in the box. I got all the bells and whistles though. So if you have it,
the garage door opener thing is awesome. It changed everything.
If you have it and I don't, I'll be writing an email to Peter saying I want whatever Chris Corfist has.
Problem is mine's all boxed away in the basement now, waiting for spring where you get to go out and do it. Well, you have facilities too.
We just put an indoor 71-yard strip in our facility designated to sprint specific performance. So come on up, Chris, or down even. Tony, when you're in Dallas, or let me know. And
I would like that. I think I'll have a little bit of free time. It'll probably be in the evening though.
Worst case scenario, we can just go for barbecue.
Barbecue work.
Yeah.
And beer.
Yep.
Jeff asked, how far does the 1080 go? It goes 100 meters. It's got 100 meters worth of cable. And we've done some fun things with it. We've modeled 110 high hurdles with it. We've modeled 100-meter dash runs with it. We've done all kinds of things using that full length. And the hurdle stuff works really well. I think that the guys at home at Flossmart thought it was the most effective hurdling workout they've ever done. It cured more technique and form issues, because if you have bad form when you're getting pulled over the hurdles, your body knows that you're going to crash, so you've got to be perfect. And we just blocked it up. We built a table that was high, so the cable ran across the top of the high hurdles, so it pulled it straight across. Michal, that's one thing I would do too, is mess with the height of the box. Just don't leave it on the floor. Think about changing the position and moving it up. Back to questions instead of chatting. Oh, wait. Using resistance bands to lose 1080, how far would you go? It depends on how many bands you have. Again, you're going to get enough to get a good pull going. So I would probably say 6 or 7 bands. And you got to pull fast. So you got to have fast hands to pull that sucker in. But you'll get a good pull and they'll feel it. Hang on, let me find my question sheet. How does surface change what you're doing? Going from turf to a rubber track, how does that going to affect the results on your app?
Oh, it doesn't. That's the beauty of it to me. That's the beauty. One of the biggest problems I found was, I was doing this was, I think one of the research studies, and again, it pioneered some great work, was Lockie, Australian based out of California now as well. But I think one of the research studies got it down to 12.6% body mass. Well, 12.6% body mass doesn't mean anything if one person's on turf and another person's on concrete because of the friction. Yeah. So the app uses solely velocity decrement. So it's based off the speed that you pull with. So regardless of the surface, you just got to make sure whatever surface you do the load velocity profiling on, that's what you do your training on. And the app will account for that because it accounts for friction because it does its load velocity.
How does it change if you attach the sled to other body parts? Like if you're pulling from a shoulder harness or...
I don't like shoulder harness at all. I learned that for multiple reasons. When I started to do it, the shoulder harness, firstly, when you go heavy, if you've got like a football athlete, well-developed, you'll get huge pinching on the shoulder here with the musculature around it because it'll dig in because they're going so hard with it. The other thing is the hips are so important to me in just athletic development and as a cue to reinforce that solid line. So what happened for me was with sled pulling is when they would sprint with heavy, it would actually jerk them back to start with. They'd have to repurpose themselves, get their center of mass under again and go. So when I went with the belt, they could already lean into it, get their forward lean, and they could ensure that they're already kind of in that good, getting into extension and getting an aggressive push punch for the 4 to 5 seconds we do it. Just on that kind of start thing with the sled push, you kind of have to be careful as well that if you go with straight arms on the sled push, you're going to find you're going to round the back much quicker. Whereas if you put a bend and try and maintain a bend, you can actually get much better leg action from a push punch and maintain the straight. But also what I found is if people go and extend the arms too early, they actually initiate and overcome inertia with their arms rather than their legs, which is not what we want from a sprint standpoint. Therefore, sled pushes, I call it a horizontal strength training exercise, very good for the preparatory phase to prepare athletes for proper mechanics, but you don't use the arms either. So I think it's less sprint specific. So they're just two of the differences I'm not a fan of the shoulder harness because at heavy loads, it pulls them back. They got to resurface themselves again. It's very hard to do that from a static start, but it's a lot easier from the hip to do from a static start. And as we just know in 100-meter sprint, the importance of the first step. If you get the first step wrong in resisted sled training, it's the same. It's not going to have as much positive effects on that early to initial acceleration.
No, did you have a time limit? I wasn't here for the pre-meeting.
To be honest, I've 2 kids under 2, so it's a war zone in the next room. So I'm much happier chatting with you guys here.
All right, I'm going to switch gears on you because I know you do a lot with middle school or pre-pubescent training and things like that. And I think that's a huge hole in the training world that I see way too many dads proud that their 12-year-old is powerlifting and can do all these things. And it's like, oh, I don't know. That's such a good idea. I appreciate the time you're spending with your son. And that's awesome. But I don't know if it's time to hang and bang when you're 12.
Yeah, I look at that's one of my main areas. I love it. I think we spoke earlier, Chris, you know, your next online one, or hopefully it's in person and I get to come up and have some of that Italian beef and them Italian sausage stuff again. I like those. You know, I do have a presentation I've done, which is the influence.
I saw it. That's why I'm asking.
I do. Yeah, I do. I have a one that's pretty well received, and it's, if you were to put an umbrella term on my PhD, you know, the one of the other areas is youth athletes are not mini adults, and that's why I'm very holistic in nature, and I struggle when things are just looked at one piece of the pie, you know, rather than the overall context of it. And I have a presentation called The Influence of Growth and Maturation on speed development in young athletes. And it's looking at the natural gains versus the training induced gains. But when you talk about middle school, you know, typically they're in the middle of their growth spurt. And the fastest point of growth in the growth spurt is called your peak height velocity. And like, just a real quick summary, there's a lot of things going on, but right from the brain even is the brain actually grows to a bigger size during that period of time, you know, in that pre-peak height velocity or mid-peak height velocity growth spurt, and we start pruning it. So we start getting rid of certain areas too of the brain, and it's one of the last times to really emphasize it's one of the times to start really emphasizing some of our motor development and motor patterns. Like by the time you're 8, 95% of your gait is formed. So that's why it's so important. Functional movement skills, foundational movement skills, exposure to multiple other things. And then that window starts closing, the central nervous system development starts closing, but we get a chance to re-emphasize and ingrain proper movement patterns, basics, sprinting, jumping. But I always say, well, it's a guy called Paddy Roach said this, it always stuck with me, is that you got to be able to control force before you can apply force. And I think that's important as well because of the stimulus that sprinting does, that it's better someone has a foundation, a very good foundation of functional movement skills before we start focusing on the application of force. So during the middle school area, that's what happens, the brain and that, but it's also the highest likelihood of injury and risk. And the reason that is that the long bones grow first, so of the legs, disproportionately to the torso. So that's why we see people's hips up here nearly in their rib cages, right? And try and get someone who's got disproportionate growth from their upper to their lower body to sprint properly. Try get them to even squat. You cannot coach someone out of rapid accelerated growth. You can't do it. The body is always under stress. But one of the most important things to know as well is that the muscle tendon unit is growing also at a disproportionate rate to the bone. So bone density is at about 60%. And then there's a lag period before that catches up. So what we need to do is reduce some of the load and the intensity we put on the athlete. So I like to use some resisted training during that period of time as a strength stimulus because it is spread across unilaterally in a cyclical movement. We can go heavy on it. It's that whole, sometimes you got to slow down to speed up. Same thing applies across the biological maturity and development of youth athletes. There's sometimes to take your foot off the gas. I always tell parents and coaches, listen to your son or daughter because their body is constantly under stress because it's always growing. So it's another time where we may need to pull back on some stimuluses and emphasize also different technical areas and aspects. And what I use from a technical standpoint with sprinting is
let them out.
Is I use the sled to emphasize the forward lean with them as well in that accelerator because they're getting used to their body. So we got to slow them down to speed them up at that period of time and re-ingrain some proper movement patterns. They might have been able to do it when they were 11, but their body just got rewired.
Besides those movement patterns, what you just said to me also is a great argument why kids should not be choosing, or we should say their parents should not be choosing a single sport that they want to focus on. For example, you want your kid to get a high school scholarship in baseball or swimming, So you do that and nothing else 12 months a year, you are pruning away all kinds of motor skills, aren't you?
Totally. And that's that early development. And I've spoke on from team sports, some podcasts on this, like, and it's that early versus late maturers. And like, you know, the person who wins the under 14 national championship, he wins the under 14 national championship. Doesn't mean he's going to win the senior national championship, you know, and we look at growth and maturity, and it's also ethnicity plays a factor as well. Whereas some, you know, Asian, Hispanic populations will mature earlier than Caucasian as well. And sometimes they'll get prioritized in a freshman football team, for example. But I'll tell you what happens, Tony, and this is one of the things, and this has been seen in soccer and rugby league, especially in Europe. A guy, Kevin Till, has done some real good research on it, is that exactly to your point. But in addition to that, what the parent or the coach does is, because the early maturer who matured earlier is bigger and stronger and faster, what we then do is we keep applauding him or her for their physical attributes. And then we start putting all their eggs only in this physical attributes. And what happens is they have an over-reliance or over-dependency on their physical attributes, and they actually don't end up developing their tactical, or their technical ability and awareness. And in soccer, it's proven huge, because what'll happen is the late maturer goes, well, I can't out-muscle him, I can't out-jump him, I can't out-sprint him. So I'm going to have to figure out better technical awareness, better tactical awareness, better skill. And then you know what happens? Biology just happens. The strength will come. So again, for me, this is about knocking down walls and creating a language of performance, and not a language of strength conditioning or this sport. It's about creating a language of performance, so that we can identify talent and nurture talent right the way throughout.
Going back to a question that's up on the board here, we have prowlers that we have also used walking with weighted sleds or tires behind us attached to the waist. This is done for a percentage twice a week, fitting into the max effort and dynamic days. If you agree with this, what part of the foot should be striking with first to get the biggest bang for the buck? What are your thoughts on this? And Louis also attaches an attachment over our shoulders with a bar with weights on that we use as we are walking. Any problems that you see with this as GPP piece for a football player?
There's a lot going on in that visualization I have in my brain. There's a lot, but you know, I'm definitely more than happy to defend that by email after this. I'll try and answer it as best I can. You know, what strikes with the foot, you do not change proper sprint mechanics. You want to make sure that you're striking optimally, and that you're not heel striking. Like, make sure you don't heel strike as well. You got that middle of the forefoot, you're striking with it, ball to feet. I think your thing looking at the tendon is a good thing to look at as well with the straight line. If you've only got tires to pull and you want to do it as a stimulus in the early preparatory phase, you know, what I've seen is it will improve that initial acceleration. I think it's very good for team sports. I think it's a good stimulus to apply. That's good. The other area about the bar on the back, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe you say it again. I've got like some picture out of Mad Max in my brain at the moment.
What are your thoughts on this? And Louis attaches, I'm guessing Louis Simmons attaches an attachment over our shoulders with the bar with weights on that, and we use it as walking. I don't know if that's like a yoke.
Maybe it's like a heavy walking sled drag. I've avoided that. I think it's good for strongman competitions. I don't think it is as much I think it can improve single leg strength, and probably would compare more to a step up or a walking lunge or something like that. But if I was a betting man for sprint specific strength, complementary strength, I'd probably be betting on my cutoff point for resisted sled training was when it was no longer cyclical. If it was a plod, or if the heel of the foot was striking, to me, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's not what I'm looking for to assist in sprint specific strength, to assist the track coach, to increase speed, to complement my unresisted sprint training program. So not to say it's wrong, but I think it has to maintain, you know, it can't be less than 2 meters per second.
I think Louis took it on the sled stuff with his GPP and.
Yeah, and for that, like I use it, it's probably like a step before how I use heavy sled pushing. I use heavy sled pushing as a GPP for my sprint specific strength horizontal training. And this sounds like that same thing, that it could be a preparatory phase, the GPP, to get them used to unilateral cyclical movement at lower velocities. I would just ensure that you always join the dots, because for me, the dots I want to join if I'm actually looking to improve speed is I want to make sure from the get-go of my GPP that I'm maintaining a forward lean, I'm improving the foot strike, and the hips aren't breaking. For early acceleration, that I'm optimizing the application of horizontal force.
Tony, do you have any questions? Or I'm going to go back to middle school.
Go back to middle school.
Okay.
So one thing with middle school, what I like to do with the sled as well, like my thing pre-middle school, like is I'm massive on, sometimes we have a habit of wanting structure training way too much. Like I'm the most unstructured man in the world when it comes to pre-12-year-olds and pre-peak height velocity and growth spurt, because we need unstructured training and we need to ensure that we expose them to multiple different stimuluses. So I have no periodization plan for my youth athletes. I like to expose them to different stimuluses. I'll even do some overspeed stuff with them. Now, I won't put them on Chris Corfus's 20% faster than they can actually run on a 1080. But
come on, that's fun.
But I'll make sure they get exposed to high velocity movements, resisted movements. We have some sled and a lateral. I've done a prowler to where to hold on to the prowler, and I have them do a broad jump. So I'm actually adding load in a jumping plane of motion as well. Just to expose them to that stimulus and ensure it's a very well-rounded, holistic program. But yeah, when we get to middle school, we start really emphasizing, becomes more moderately structured, and we start emphasizing some aspects. So
I actually had a question. I had a question the other day. Somebody emailed me and wanted to know if their 12-year-old should start a formal weightlifting and sprinting program, kind of implying that both things were very advanced. And what I told him was that he should not start a weight program until he is body strong. In other words, push-ups, that kind of thing. But sprinting needs to be done from like the age of 3 on. Wouldn't you agree?
100%. No, I definitely agree with the second part. And the first part, I don't disagree, Tony. I just think that we need to move away from the term weights and just say strength training. I think we need to, I think we can implement strength training and resistance, but I agree with your progression though. You need to be able to control force before you look at kind of the application of force. But from a sprinting standpoint, if your gait is 95% form by the time you're 9 years of age, they've got to be sprinting. And I'll tell a funny story. I'd probably claim this if this wasn't recorded and you were going to put it out in line, but I'll have to give the person credit. It was Avery Fagenbaum who's done huge work in youth athletes and sprinting, or in youth athletes and pediatric exercise physiology. And he told a story before about a parent who went in, I'm trying to remember the story on the spot here, but he went into the doctor, and the doctor said, you're too young, so we don't want you doing any plyometric activity. So the doctor wrote a note to the school to say no, no strength, no weights, no plyometrics, because the whole thing about before you do plyometrics, you should be able to squat 2 times body weight or 1.5 times body weight. So he said, and then the PE coach wrote back and said, okay, we won't do any plyometrics, but we'll just run, jump, and sprint, but we won't do any plyometrics. And the doctor wrote back and said, that's fine. You can run, you can jump, you can sprint, but don't do any plyometrics. So,
I love it. What would you do with, let's say, an 11-year-old in a weight room?
Yeah, so what we develop is like in our weight room, and I know everyone doesn't have this, but my way of developing, I make sure our rigs have got monkey bars on it to where they can climb. And I'm a big believer in you hang, you climb, you crawl. If you want to strengthen a youth athlete's shoulder, put them on a climbing wall. Put them on a climbing wall. That's how you'll strengthen all aspects of that glenohumeral joint and get them to move. And I've got some, you know, this is an hour. I could talk for hours on this, and I'm more than happy to do it. But I've got a kind of assess, interpret, prescribe presentation for right, pre, mid, and post. But it is based on speed development. So if I want to improve someone's speed, obviously we got to get them to sprint. But I'll ensure that I'm really focusing on motor control, and I'm focusing on their movement in coronal plane, sagittal plane. I like hangs, I like climbs, I like crawls. I think it's important to introduce them as well to, you know, strength. It's not that you can't lift until a certain age. We just need to ensure that we have training competence, because strength can be trained across the continuum. But I really put an emphasis on holistic, foundational, functional movement skills. I love hangs, I love climbs, I love crawls, but I got to get them moving fast as well. And then we'll introduce body weight movements. And then when, like you said, their body's strong and they can demonstrate proper functional movement patterns, then I'll start putting some load on it as well. But here's the thing I see, Tony. I get the dad that comes in that wants him to get bigger.
Oh.
And I'm going, and let's take mass specific force out of it for a second. I'm going, he hasn't had puberty. He doesn't have testosterone, just like flogging a dead horse here. You know, there's no androgen concentrations there. So what we need to do is, what I'm saying is, well, I'll tell you what, let's lay the foundation so that as soon as he gets to that point to where he's got this injection of testosterone, you know, and females get estrogen, and there's I don't even know what I say anymore. Do I say estrogen or estrogen? There's so many Irish versus American terms. That there's other areas we really need to hone in and focus on as well, because of the widening of the hips and the Q angle and the pressure that's placed on the knee for females with regards to strength training. And it's so important that they have that. On the middle school, Tony, and this is one of the areas where, again, I could talk about this forever on how youth apply to this, is what's really important is that they are strong going into the growth spurt. So I love low-level pogo hops, plyometrics, sprints, flies, because what we're strengthening there is the tendon. And then the tendon is what actually attenuates all the forces. So if they're strong going into the growth spurt, going into middle school by doing sprinting and functional movement patterns and body weight movements and laying the foundation, once they get into that mid peak height velocity and that middle school area, we diminish or decrease the likelihood of injury because their tendons are stiffer and they're able to attenuate the forces that's put on them. Because here's one that comes after peak height velocity or the growth spurt, you get a thing called peak weight velocity. And the reason you get peak weight velocity is not only the growth of the, again, do I say skeletal or skeletal? I can't remember anymore. I'm here too long. After you get that bone density increase, you also then get, males get testosterone, females get estrogen/estrogen, and they develop adipose tissue, breasts. So we get this big increase in weight. Now, all of a sudden, Tony, let's say you gave one of your sprinters a weight vest and made him run with it. You'd be damn sure he'd be pretty sore in the morning, right? And he wouldn't go too fast. Well, that's what actually happens. They get this rapid, accelerated period of weight in addition that follows the growth spurt. So we got to be careful with that as well. And we have to make sure that they're prepared and that the tendons are strong enough for it. Again, re-emphasizing the need and the importance of youth athletes just getting up to sprinting. When I first came in with athlete training and health, you know, the first thing I got rid of is we had an acceleration day and a linear day. And 12-year-olds, let's get these fellas up to top speed. Like you'll go through acceleration just to get to top speed. And one of the things which we talked a little bit about with youth athletes, which people forget about a lot is, I mean, your youth athletes, they'll hit top speed in 15 meters. Like, you know, it doesn't 20 meters. Like you're young, you know, and then you start getting into high school and stuff. Obviously, yeah, they'll start hitting it at, you know, 25, 30 meters and stuff as well. But this whole thing of 50 to 60 meters, yeah, that's the elites. Even your professional level team sport athletes, they'll hit it in 35 to 40 meters, you know. So we just have to be, because the last thing we want for speed development is residual fatigue.
Yep. And two comments that I was thinking about when you were saying this stuff. One is that when you focus on max speed with little kids, they love it.
Yeah.
They love it. It's joyful. And then the other thing is almost all movement that I see with young kids is endurance based, which is not improving their skills.
Nope. And it's not preparing them for what they're going to go under when they hit that growth spurt, because obviously, you know, we're not getting that tendon adaptation and stuff. And that's why I like repetitive low level kind of pogos with them. Love them, because it's really preparing that spring of the body to be able to attenuate the forces as we can I use attenuate, Chris? Are you gonna complain about that and domicile later, or is attenuate okay?
It's okay.
It's okay.
Upstairs for thinking, downstairs for Irish dancing.
You heard it here first by you in Chicago. Yeah. No, I'm more than happy to go into detail sometime, guys, on that for you. I think it's a untapped resource, and I think it's really important for coaches and parents to be aware of, is just some of these maturational changes that happen and making sure we take a wide lens and scope on it.
I would like to have you back for another TFC and really talk about youth development. I don't know if we've ever talked about it, and it's important. I think really important, especially in today's world of endurance, specialization, parents choosing what the kids are going to do, parents choosing advanced training and high cost training that may not be good for their kids. I think coaches should know about those things.
Yeah, I usually have one line to say to parents is, don't be good at something, be good at everything when it comes to dealing with youth athletes. You know, that's critical, is that holistic development. Don't be good at something, be good at everything. Because
love it.
Yeah. So and I already kind of have that. I have that one prepped, so it won't be as many. I won't be burning the midnight.
I know, I saw that one. That was the one where I was giving you a hard time, and all the people around either thought I was the biggest asshole in the world. They didn't know that I was just giving you a hard time. And everyone's looking at me like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that and he asked that. I was I was the other side of the world. I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, you can. You definitely broke some.
Like when I was training barefoot, I was barefoot in the gym, and they tried to throw me out for being barefoot in the gym. And I told them I had my barefoot shoes on.
Yeah.
Well, I'm good. Michal, I'm good. I'm out of questions. You answered 2 with that last response, the last 2 that I had.
Well, yeah.
I probably have about an hour worth of questions that we can eat some barbecue at 10:50 and have a couple cold IPAs. Well, you probably only drink Guinness though, right?
Only when I'm in Ireland. I wouldn't drink it here. But
it's garbage here, right?
Yeah. You said that, not me. I'm a guest in this country, so I'm not going to pass a remark like that. But no, and I'm more than happy to. And I got a sled and a prowler, Tony, on its way up to you as well. So. Oh,
I am so stoked about being a sled and prowler guy right now. I mean, I can't wait.
So, but guys, thanks a million for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for the platform as well. You know, for me, it's good to. One of the things I really wanted to do from this, and I hope people will take from it, is that to look at it from a holistic standpoint, and it's a tool, and it's not a tool for everybody to use, and it's not a tool you use all season long, and it's not the only thing you do, and it's one piece of the pie. And the platform for you guys just to give me to come on and expand on some of the research that's came out in the last 2 years on it's supplementing and not substituting.
Love it.
Appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Michal. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Yeah. Happy Christmas, guys.
Enjoy your theater.
I will do. Thanks. And thanks everybody as well. Any questions, feel free to just email me.
And thanks for the app, by the way.
Oh yeah, by all means, it's free. So yeah, use it. As long as it helps coaches.
Have a good one.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.